would a perfect world be like? Imagine it. Would it be a world without disease? Without crime or corruption? Would it be a world without failure? Or without suffering? Or struggle? Would it be a world without troubled relationships? Without bad decisions or stupidity? Would it be a world without death? Would such a perfect world be made up of perfectly happy people? Can you imagine such a world? Honestly, I can't. Because if such a world were to exist, then some significant aspect of our humanity would be gone. The world was filled with perfectly fulfilled people who had everything. Something of our humanity would be violated. Now, that's not to say that it is not a question that can go away. Something about the struggles and the pain of this world, something about the fact that death and disease and disaster and human stupidity exists, all of those questions make us imagine a better world. We can imagine that improvement going on up in here, taking on a life of its own. Until, yes, somewhere in here, perhaps only as a fantasy, dwells a perfect world. The Jewish response to this question of a perfect world, and then the Christian response, is that God is the one who transforms the world. So there is some reality quite outside of us that does the transforming, the transfiguring, the glorifying. And somehow in that process, things like happiness move into joy, perhaps what we could imagine as perfection. Now, this kind of experience, I could imagine calling God's work with us. This isn't just God working through us or with us. We are God's work. In the midst of everything that could simply be better, in the midst of all the things we could imagine perfecting about this world, all of it is God's work. So are we. This first reading that we heard from the book of Nehemiah, I actually took the time to reread the whole book this week. And for those of us who are seduced by a big project, for those of us who perhaps used to be architects, or maybe still are, for those of us who like to build things up over time, the book of Nehemiah is that kind of a book that makes me excited. Because here is what's happening. Nehemiah is writing 450 years before Jesus. For those of you who know the story, around 580 years before Jesus existed, the people of Judah, the whole city of Jerusalem, was destroyed by the Babylonian Empire. All those dreams of a perfect world, perfect Jewish community, wiped out. And Israel's best and brightest were deported as exiles out into Babylon. Well, politics and the history of the world being what it is, Babylon was eventually overthrown by the Empire of Persia. And in the court of the king of Persia, Nehemiah, a devout Jew, served as a court official. He asked the king if he might be able to go back to a land he did not know that was home. He wanted to go back and repair the walls of Jerusalem, which had been completely flattened. course, he tells the king, I'm going to go and repair the graves of my ancestors. A slight lie. That's okay. Because he needed to get back. Somehow, by God's grace, by God's providence, Nehemiah gets to go back. And the king supplies him with all the papers, all the authority, all the materials he needs in order to do exactly that, to build up the walls surrounding Jerusalem. Now, as I was reading Nehemiah this week, what it was like was this vast cast of credits where Nehemiah says, well, from this gate to this point in the wall, that was built by so-and-so's family. And then I managed to get these other people to pick up the work from that point to this market gate. And from the market gate over to the water gate, where there's another family that paid for that. And then there was another group of people that worked on this, and all the way around the city. And this was exactly how they got it done. In apparently a miraculous 52 days. A destitute, depressed people were gathered up by Nehemiah, who arrives out of nowhere and provides a vision. And in that vision, he says, pick up the junk, the rubble, whatever, build up the walls. And all of the different vying power structures, the Ammonites, the Arabs, you name it, all around Jerusalem, were mocking these depressing, raggedy people. Why are you bothering to build? If you do, we'll tear it down. And so they continued building the walls with a sword in one hand and construction materials in the other. They were determined to build up this sacred city again. Well, obviously, Nehemiah puts his heart and soul into it. And the interesting thing about this man, as he was writing, is that he leaves in almost a memoir style this sense that he himself, as a leader, was not going to be a corrupt leader. He knew that political corruption was one of the things that had gotten the land into trouble, that it had fallen apart, and that exile in Babylon had taken place. So he said, that's not the kind of leader I'm going to be. He didn't lord it over people. He himself went to work. He didn't exact the leader's kind of wages and food and treasure. No, he kept life simple for himself and his household. And he writes it in such a way, in fact, his very last words in the book of Nehemiah are, remember me, Lord, for the good that I did. So far as we can tell, hoping that he's honest, he sure did. Well, as it turns out, Nehemiah gets the wall built. The entire city is excited about what they've done, and now Nehemiah starts to meddle with people's lives, and this is how. You see, he doesn't have to just work to restore the city architecturally. He also has to work politically to restore and transform, and culturally to restore and transform this capital city of the Jewish land of Judah. So he looks these people straight in the eye, and he says, you're going to have to hear the words of the law of Moses. So here we have an experience. There at the water gate, this newly restored gate, there in the square around it, he invites men, women, everybody to come and listen as Ezra the priest, scribe, reads the law. You see, Nehemiah's vision was one to not just do a little bit of renovation work. It was to transform people's lives. And it was to transform people's lives not as he imagined it, but as he believed the people of Israel had received it from God himself. So, the law is read. And as you heard it in today's reading, they freaked out. They started crying. Why? Because these people had never heard these words from the law of Moses spoken so clearly to them. They couldn't even understand the Hebrew. They needed to have it spoken back to them in Aramaic. Such had been the deteriorated culture of the city of Jerusalem, with whatever few people were left there after that terrible experience of 587 BC. They had lost all sense of what it meant to have a Jewish life. And according to the law of Moses, that Jewish life is a perfect life and a perfect world in the sight of God. Now, That's what Nehemiah is trying to do. He's trying to create a perfect world within the walls of this city that he just built up. And now, as he reads the source of that vision, that law of Moses, people start to cry. This is not what they were expecting. Nehemiah makes it clear, well, if you've got these mixed marriages with these pagan people, you're going to have to get a divorce. If you're exacting interest on loans from your fellow Jews, well, you're not supposed to be doing that either, according to the law of Moses, so we're going to have to stop the banking industry. And then we're going to have to clean up the temple. We're going to have to establish that cycle of prayer and worship and sacrifice which is going on there. Oh, so much work. Nehemiah actually gets it done. And faithful to his word, he goes back to the king of Persia until he gets word that they blew it again. All of his work toward a perfect world, toward creating this perfect home for Jewish community, he had to go back again a dozen years later and try it again. And that is how his life went on. You cannot, it seems, trust that the perfect world you've created is going to last for very long. And yet we are seduced by this imaginary concept, this vision within our lives. What if we had a perfect world? Well, let's start at least with ourselves here. What if we had a perfect church? Perfect church. It's such a seductive thought, and yet every time I think about what it would be like to have a perfect church, I just read the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians. That's a screwed up church, people, and that's from the very beginning. There, Paul writes to this imperfect church, because in this church, amazingly, they're not lacking in gifts. They're not lacking in skills. It's not a church that's particularly weak in many ways, but it is a church where people's egos and pride are destroying a sense of community. And that's something that definitely can destroy any perfect world we've got. Paul says, look, you all have the story of Jesus. You have the story of him crucified and risen. And in the midst of that, can any one of you, with all of your pride and ego and willpower, proclaim the power of that story all by yourself? You think you can carry that into the world on your own shoulders? No. Paul says there are all sorts of gifts in this church. Many gifts. Some of them are churchy, like being an apostle, or an interpreter of tongues, or a teacher. Some of them are very basic. Being a servant, being a companion in the way, being one who prays with others, stands by others, cares for them. And as he lists these roles, these different tasks that the church must have, I'm reminded of how I was reading in the book of Nehemiah. All those credits that Nehemiah gives. Well, this family did this part of the wall, and this family did this part of the wall, and this family fixed this gate, and on and on and on until the city was built up. No matter what vision of a perfected world we have, whether it's 2,500 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, or today, there's always going to be a list of credits. There's always going to be a list of people whose lives wove into that story, that vision. And somehow, in the midst of all those credits, God's name begins it, and God's name comes at the end. When we imagine this perfect world, you're right, there's willpower, there's determination, there's the part that we all play. But because we believe that God acts in it, Jesus proclaims an interesting message to you and to me today. He proclaims this message to his hometown when he comes on the Sabbath day, the day of rest, to the synagogue and reads the text in front of him. What a vision. Blind people seeing, captives free, oppressed, out they go to live lives in liberty with God. Now, this is a word of encouragement to those people in his neighborhood who would have known the Roman Empire as their oppressors. And as that book of Isaiah was opened up to that 61st chapter, Jesus is reading that word of encouragement, which was written to those very exiles themselves. Jesus is reading a vision of people coming back home. Something about a perfect world has to do with people coming back home. Whatever home may be, it may not be what you grew up with, but somehow, even in the midst of what we think we grew up with, every person has within their heart a sense of what home could be. Home is union, reconciliation, and transformation. It's where we are free to be not only vulnerable, but powerful by the power of God. That is what I think a perfected world looks like. A perfected world is a world wherein people look inside and say, I know where my home is, where I belong. And somehow I know that I belong to that place where others belong. There's a vision within the human soul that acknowledges belonging to be life-giving. Home is union with God and humanity in a way nothing else can replace. I think it's telling that Jesus speaks these words on the Jewish Sabbath. Jesus speaks these words on the Sabbath because in the Jewish life, we mimic the creative power of God. 6 days of work, 7th day of rest. And on that 7th day of rest, what do Jews do? They allow the mystery of a perfected world to seep into their lives. It's not just a day of laying back. Certainly not a day for shopping. It's not a day for getting extra stuff done that you wanted to get done in the 6 days before. Shabbat, the day of rest, is a day of restoration into a perfect world. It is this one day out of 7 where we can imagine that struggle and turmoil are not the order of the day. That conflict and corruption and wondering if there will be enough are not at the center of our attention. Shabbat, God's day of rest, and our day of rest together are a taste of that glory of a perfected world. A taste of glory. Because I'm not sure any human being would know what to do in a perfect world. Because a perfect world is glory. A perfect world transformed by God. We might not even know what to do with such goodness. We might even mess it up. Such a world, Jesus says, it's been fulfilled in your hearing, you who desire to go back home. Jesus says this, words of encouragement to exiles, words of encouragement to people in his hometown, words of encouragement to you and to me. Rest, he says, rest in the power of God's glory.